Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with my very late February wrap-up. As I'm sure everybody knows, things have just been kind of wild lately, so I'm sorry this is so late. I hope everybody is doing well and keeping safe, which is of course not just safe for us, but also for the most vulnerable members in our community. And I also want to mention, starting in this wrap-up and possibly for the foreseeable future, I think I'm going to be filming these in 2 chunks because honestly, depending on how good a reading month I have, I just can't face the prospect of reviewing 17 books in a row. But when I did polls, a lot of you guys said that you prefer to watch one longer video rather than 2 shorter ones, so I'm just gonna kind of splice them together. So that's why you'll see probably like an outfit change or something halfway through the video. But let's get into the books. The first one I finished was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This is the first book we read for our Austen Anonymous read-along. We'll link all of the information in the description box. We love discussing this book with our 2 guest hosts, Rhonda from Cubicle Blog and Olivia from Olivia's Catastrophe. And this is basically a parody of a gothic novel. We follow our heroine, Catherine Morland. Her and her family are comfortably off, but they're definitely not like high society. And for the first time, she gets the opportunity to go to Bath for the season. And then the second half of the book is really where the gothic parody elements kind of take off. And I really enjoyed this one, actually a lot more than I remembered even. I found Catherine a really enjoyable heroine and main character. I remembered her being kind of letting herself get walked all over, and for the most part that doesn't really happen. Like, she is very naive in some ways because she's never experienced like city life before, but she holds her ground. She doesn't let people like talk her into doing something that she thinks is wrong, and I just like really admired her. I loved the humor and the satire in this book, and I also really enjoyed the like defense of novels that is kind of scattered throughout this book. I know some people feel like that can be a little bit like heavy-handed, but I really enjoyed it. There's some really great passages that I think are very applicable even to publishing and reading nowadays. Like, it used to be that novels were looked down on, and I feel like now other types of writing that are associated with women, such as young adult and romance and the romance genre, those are kind of the ones that get looked down on by the wider literary world. Tilney is such a clever and funny character. I kind of wish we had gotten more of him, and I also could have done with less of John Thorpe. I understand his purpose in the story, but I just didn't like him. And I gave Northanger Abbey 4 stars. Next, I finished Winterling by Sarah Prinius. This is the first book in a trilogy, and we follow our main character Fur, which is short for Jennifer, and she's grown up with her grandmother. She doesn't really know a lot about her parents, and then one day she sort of accidentally goes through something called the Way, which is what connects our world to the fairy world. And while she's there, she realizes that the 2 worlds are even more connected than she thinks. Things are going wrong in the human world, like the weather is really dangerous, and Fur realizes that it's something to do with something that had happened in the fairy world, and she has to figure out a way to make things right, along with the very reluctant help of some of the allies and friends that she makes over in the fairy world, such as a puck boy named Rook. And I ended up really liking this. The start was kind of hard for me. I didn't feel like an emotional connection to this book until a little further on, and especially because we start out with Fur living at home with her grandmother, and I feel like we're supposed to get the sense that their relationship is very important. I really had a hard time seeing that emotional connection between them, and even just connecting to Fur as a main character. But once she went through the Way and we spent more time with Fur, and we actually started getting more information about the way she had grown up with her grandmother and the things that her grandmother had done to keep her safe, that's when I finally started really seeing that connection, and really enjoying the book a lot more. I feel like this book is a really good balance of old world feeling folklore, like the fairies and the pucks and all of this. Like, you can demand an answer by asking them 3 times or things like that, like these very old stories or concepts. I feel like it was a good blend of that and Sarah Prinius putting her own spin on things. And I also loved the way that herbs and healing magic was used in this book. Fur kind of realizes that she has a talent for that, and that's one of the ways that she starts making allies and making friends, and that was something I just really loved. I really love in books when small acts of kindness are shown to have unimaginable importance later on, which, not that you shouldn't do them for their own sake, but I think it's really satisfying when we see that compassion is not a sign of weakness, that it is actually rewarded. I just personally really like that. I did end up giving this book 3.5 stars, but I'm really excited to continue the series. Next, I finally read my first N.K. Jemisin book, and that was The 100,000 Kingdoms, and you guys, oh my god, this was so good. I know everybody else in the world probably already knows that N.K. Jemisin is a genius, so we follow our main character Yena, and right at the beginning of the book she is summoned to the kingdom that her mother was from, I think. She's summoned by her grandfather, who she's never met, had no interest in meeting, and when she gets there, she's basically told, like, congratulations, you're participating in the competition for the throne, and if you don't win, you'll get killed. She doesn't want to be here, she doesn't want to participate in this, but she kind of realizes that because of all of these political reasons and just like reasons for her own safety. She has no choice, so Yena gets wrapped up into this world of politics and plotting. The gods and the mythology and all of that aspect of the world building is very, very important in this book, and there's some backstory that you learn about like a war basically that the gods had, and some of them were defeated, and how that affected all of the kingdoms in this world, like all of these kingdoms of humans. I really, really loved Yena as a main character. She's so brave and clever, and she does make mistakes. Like, she's really at a disadvantage, you know, being in this political setting that she's never had any experience with before, or very limited experience. So it's not like she shows up and she knows immediately what to do, but I felt like she wasn't making dumb choices. Like, even the cases where she made mistakes, it was very understandable why she was making them. I also really loved the world building, like the complexity there, and the way that the setting and the lore and the characters all interacted. The setup for this book is pretty complex, but it never felt too confusing. Like, there were occasional snippets where I wasn't immediately sure what we were getting or where it fit in, but we got those explained, I think, in a reasonable amount of time. Like, this book was complicated in, I think, a good way. Like, I didn't feel like it came at the expense of the story or the characters. I also really loved the writing. It's the right kind of descriptive. It's writing that has kind of a rhythm to it, but it's not overly flowery. It was also very quick to read, like the style of the writing and also just how compelling the story was. I absolutely flew through this book in like a day or something, maybe a day and a half. And I also really, really enjoyed the character relationships in this book. They're so messy and complicated and strange, some of them. As you can probably tell from my gushing, I gave this book 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. There were a few scenes here and there that I think could have been done maybe a little better or a little bit differently, but like, at the end of the day, this book is one of those that just feels so complete in itself, where it's like, even if I didn't enjoy those scenes as much, like, they fit with the story so well that I don't really feel like I can take points off for it, if that makes sense. And also, I really, really loved the ending. It was just fantastic. This book was phenomenal. 5 stars. Loved it. Fully on board the N.K. Jemisin bandwagon. Next, I actually read a fan fiction, and because it's on Goodreads, I'm gonna count it, and I was actually recommended this through Goodreads. It was from Tatiana Night Owl, who I follow, and I really, really enjoy her reviews, and she was talking about Mansfield Park, I think, and she mentioned a couple of stories that kind of give like an alternate ending for Mansfield Park. If you've read it, you probably know the part I'm talking about, and this was one of them. I'll actually link the fanfiction down below. And this was so, so good. It's like such a good reminder of how there are so many talented writers out there who are not yet published. So this is, like I said, kind of an alternate ending for Mansfield Park, where some relationship things go a little bit differently. I thought the writing was so true to Jane Austen's style in a way that didn't feel artificial. I really loved the characterization. Like, I think Fanny's characterization really shone, but also the other characters around her, and especially like Mary Crawford. I think the way she was written in this story, it felt very true to who Mary is in the original novel, while also giving her, I think, a little more opportunity for growth. And another point in the story's favor is I think it was mostly pretty believable, even though it's very different from how the novel ends. I could see this happening for the most part. Like, if certain small decisions had gone a different way, I think this is feasible, which actually made it, you know, more enjoyable, and especially the romance, it made it more enjoyable. There was one stage of the love interest's character development that I think happened a little too quickly compared to the rest of the story, but other than that, I really enjoyed this. I highly recommend this if you have read Mansfield Park and were a little bit dissatisfied with that ending. And I gave Everingham 4 stars. I just realized I don't think I actually told you what the name of the story was, but it's Everingham. Next, I read Heart of the Moors by Holly Black, and I think it takes place between the first movie and the second. I realize it's going to be kind of hard to talk about this one without spoiling some aspects of the Maleficent movie, so if you haven't seen the Maleficent movie, which I highly, highly recommend, then skip this part for now. But this takes place after the events of the movie, the first movie, and Aurora is trying to figure out how to lead her kingdom. She's trying to continue or to really solidify the temporary peace between the fairies and the humans. She's aided by Prince Philip, but she doesn't really know what their relationship is like because, like, he wasn't her true love, so how does she interact with him? Like, she doesn't know if she likes him as a friend or something more than that. She doesn't really know how he feels about her, and she also has her godmother Maleficent, who she loves very much and who obviously loves her, but the relationship can also have a little bit of friction because Maleficent is kind of one of the fairies who doesn't necessarily want peace between the humans and the fairy kingdoms. There's a lot of distrust on both sides, and Aurora is trying to figure out how to deal with this, in addition to basically just getting the courtiers and advisors that she has to listen to her and to treat her like a ruler rather than a little girl that they can control and lead around. I found the conflict of the story pretty believable. It makes sense to me that after the first movie there would still be this distrust between the fairies and the humans. The interpersonal conflicts, while sometimes frustrating, also made sense to me. Like, even though there were a couple places where I just wanted to tell the characters to talk to each other and talk about their feelings, I get why they didn't. And this book was just like pleasant to read, which is not to say that bad things didn't happen, but it felt kind of cozy for some reason, which is exactly what I was in the mood for. The ending, in some ways it happened too fast, and there were a couple of events near the end that I think were kind of unnecessary. And I also think the writing was a little inconsistent. I have read other Holly Black books and I really enjoy her writing style in general, and I feel like this one felt a little bit more stilted, and I think part of that relates to one of my other complaints, which was that there were parts of this book that felt like it was trying too hard to remind you of the movie. Like certain phrases that were used a lot, or descriptions of characters, like basically reminding you of like the events of the movie or the actors who played the characters or things like that. Also, we got to see more Diaval, who I absolutely loved in the movie, so that was a huge plus as well. And I ended up giving Heart of the Moors 3.5 stars. I do definitely recommend it if you enjoyed the Maleficent movie. Next, I finished The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee. This is an own voice historical fiction novel set right around, I think, the beginning of the 1900s in Atlanta, Georgia. And our main character is Jo Kwon, and she is Chinese, and that's where the Own Voices rep comes in. And in the area and time period that she's living in, Chinese people and lots of different populations are really treated badly. And as a result of that, right at the beginning of the book, Jo actually loses her job because of racism. And she gets the idea to start writing for a newspaper, and she starts it as kind of an advice column that I think is specifically supposed to be about like women's issues and like, you know, like women's magazines, like dresses and recipes and all the things that like women are supposed to pay attention to. And gradually, as she starts writing these, she starts getting more and more political and more focused on social commentary and the things that are wrong with the place that she's living in. Even though a lot of people love her column, some people are starting to get upset that she is threatening the status quo. And while this is going on, Jo starts finding out more about her birth parents, and I really enjoyed this. I loved Jo as a main character. Like, she's so clever and strong and spunky. I love how smart she was and how determined she was to go after what she wanted, even in the face of really enormous setbacks or obstacles. I loved the social commentary in this book. I really enjoyed the writing too, and the setting, and the way that we got a very clear picture of Atlanta at this time period. I was also really impressed with how the different plot lines came together. Like, there's one about her column, of course, but there's also the plot line about her finding out more about her birth family, which I thought was really well done, because I feel like from the synopsis it kind of made it sound like that mystery was going to take over everything else, and I don't feel like it did. I feel like it was definitely important to Jo, but she also had other things going on. And she actually starts working as a lady's maid for a pretty awful girl, so you see that conflict as well, and I just was really impressed with how balanced everything felt. There's also a romance subplot in this book that I really enjoyed. I could see some people feeling like it wasn't developed enough, or that it didn't get enough page time or something, but I actually really enjoyed it. I don't know what it was, but it felt very believable to me, and it was also just very like sweet and wholesome. Like, the way that these characters like supported each other, I just really liked it. And I think one of the reasons people might feel like it's underdeveloped is it's one of those romances where they do spend time together. They have pretty significant interactions, but they're not necessarily romantic interactions until much later. But by the time they were, and by the time the characters were acknowledging they had feelings for each other, I already believed it. I was like, that makes sense. Like, I was kind of getting those vibes from you guys, so I'm glad that I wasn't making that up. Also, I really loved the ending of this book. It made me super emotional. Like, I just think it was so well done. Really hopeful and realistic at the same time. I do have a couple of complaints about this book. One of them is the character who is kind of Jo's father figure. I feel like he was really underdeveloped. Like, obviously he's a very important person in Jo's life, and she spends a lot of time with him, and a lot of the like certain choices that she makes are based on like him and on the two of them basically taking care of each other. So with all of that, it kind of felt more noticeable that he wasn't very well developed. And I also had kind of some issues with like the other Chinese side characters we had. Most of them were in flashback so that we could explain why Jo knew how to do something. Like, they were basically just backstory, and I am also not Chinese, so I can't like speak to this personally, but just some of the ways that those Chinese side characters were used felt a little bit like reductive almost, or like there were a couple of places where it felt like the mystical minority trope a little bit. But overall, there were so many strengths with this book. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I would highly recommend it. Next, I read Piper by Jay Asher and Jessica Freeberg, illustrated by Jeff Stokely. And I already mentioned this in a couple of TBR videos, but based on the allegations against Jay Asher, I did not rate this book on Goodreads. I don't want to like contribute to essentially promoting this book by rating it on Goodreads, but I do want to talk about my thoughts on it. So if you have it lying around already, you can kind of decide if you even want to pick it up. So this is a Pied Piper retelling. We follow our main character Maggie, who is deaf, and everyone in her village kind of treats her badly because of this. And then one day a boy shows up who seems to really care about her and to really want to get to know her and pay attention to her. He's one of the only people to really treat her with kindness, and so she starts spending a lot of time with him, starting to develop romantic feelings for him. But there's this kind of sinister mystery that seems to be following him, and overall I just thought this was fine. I did like the art style for the most part. Like some of the characters especially, I really liked their designs and some of the setting and everything. I thought this was kind of an interesting concept for like the Pied Piper story. And I also liked Maggie as a main character, but there were a lot of things I thought were really underdeveloped. The love interest character was really underdeveloped. I don't feel like we got to know him, and not in a way that I think was supposed to be mysterious, but in a way where I'm like, why does Maggie care about this guy so much? And I guess it kind of makes sense because he was one of the only people to show her kindness or like basic human decency, but it still was just like not very interesting to read about. And I feel like the summary of this graphic novel that I saw on Goodreads is like kind of misleading. And maybe this is my fault for interpreting things a certain way, but it kind of made it feel like this was going to be an examination of like toxic relationships or something, and that's not really what happened. Like there was a potentially sinister mystery surrounding this guy, but not really in that context. And even taking the plot by itself, like separate from my expectations of it, I'm already struggling to remember what happened in this graphic novel, and I was even struggling to remember it a few days after I finished it when I was writing down some notes on Goodreads. So this was pretty unmemorable. It was fine. Next, I finished Becoming Mrs. Lewis by Patty Callahan. This is a historical fiction novel based on the life of a real person, Joy Davidman, who ended up being C.S. Lewis's wife. It's about their relationship beginning through letters and then meeting in person, becoming very, very good friends, and eventually ending up married. And unfortunately, this was a huge, huge disappointment to me, because when I first heard about her, I even remember thinking at the time, like, this sounds like something that happens in novels, because she was an American woman who wrote letters to C.S. Lewis and he replied, and they started this correspondence. They had a lot of similar interests. She ended up moving to England and she was going to get her temporary visa taken away. So C.S. Lewis married her as kind of a green card marriage situation, and then she got very, very sick, and by that time they had actually fallen in love. So they wanted to have a like official wedding ceremony. So their story is something that like sounds like a novel. I just really, really didn't like this book. I did have a couple of things I liked about it. I really loved the descriptions of England, like the scenery and the setting and everything. They were just really beautiful. They made me think about when I took a trip there. I think some parts of the ending were really beautiful and really powerful, very well done. They made me think about some things in a different way. And the last thing I really liked is like the poetry and the information I actually got about Joy Davidman. Like she sounds like such an interesting woman, and I actually really want to learn more about her now and about her work and her writing, because she was a poet and author in her own right as well. But unfortunately, I had a ton of problems with this book, and probably the biggest one could be summed up as this book should have been nonfiction. I could tell that Patty Callahan was so passionate about her subject and had done like so much research on it. I think this could have made like a really stellar nonfiction book with maybe a narrative bent, because all of the fiction aspects just like I really, really didn't like. The writing, first off, was just so awkward and clunky, and like emotions were like really over-explained. Like there was no emotional subtlety there. There were these like huge like life-changing revelations that were just like glossed over in a couple of paragraphs or pages. So I guess that's kind of another problem I had with the writing, is some of it was over-explained and some of it was like completely under-explained. I also hated the characterization of C.S. Lewis especially. I've read like relatively few works of his compared to his body of work, but I have really loved them, and he's such an interesting person. And I just don't think Patty Callahan did a good job of like writing his dialogue. Like this man was famous for being intelligent and clever and well-spoken, and to like see his dialogue was like, he did not feel like that. I also really hated how heavy-handed the themes were in this book. I just want to say, if you don't like reading books that talk about religion, this is definitely not a book for you. And I don't mind reading that in books if it's done well, and I don't think this was done well at all. It felt really, really simplified, and obviously everybody's experience is different, so this could have been the way that Joy Davidman experienced it, but to me, as somebody who is religious, it just felt really, really oversimplified, very trite even. There were a few places near the very end of the book that I think this got a lot better, that I actually found really, really interesting and profound to read about, but for the most part, I don't think it was handled in a complex or thoughtful way. And another thing about that is Joy Davidman was Jewish. I don't think her family was really practicing, but she was Jewish before she eventually converted to Christianity later in life. And just the way that her Jewish background and heritage and family were talked about felt very uncomfortable to me. This is another case where I can't personally speak to that representation, but it just felt handled in a way that felt very dismissive. And that's another thing that I don't think the book really addressed. There were one or two passing mentions of anti-Semitism, but that theme or topic was not handled at all thoughtfully in the book. Definitely not extensively. I will link my Goodreads review down below because I go into a little more depth, but I'm in the minority here. A lot of people absolutely adore this book. It really, really didn't work for me, unfortunately. I gave Becoming Mrs. Lewis 2.5 stars. Next, I finished Moonlight Ashes by Sophie Mason, or Masson. This is a fairy tale retelling of Cinderella. The start of the book is pretty much the setup of Cinderella, except our main character is named Selena, and her mother has died and her father has remarried. So she has a cruel stepmother and two stepsisters, and she's forced to work as a servant for them. But she starts having dreams about her mother, kind of related to some things that her mother may have left her, and some of it starts looking like magic. And there's a specific type of magic in this world that is forbidden and is controlled by what kind of seem like secret police almost. So this is definitely not something that you want to have or that you want people to know that you have. Sorry, this cover is really shiny. So Selena, after she goes to the ball and everything, she ends up getting into trouble and kind of getting pulled into some political things that are going on with her kingdom and some of the other kingdoms. And this was a very weird book. The beginning is definitely very slow, but I actually liked it. Like just the description and the fairy tale feeling of the story was very cozy and enjoyable to read. I liked seeing the little glimpses of magic, and I was actually kind of liking where the book was headed. And then I also really liked the very end of the book. It was very confusing, some of it, but it's something that gets more clever the more I think about it, which is kind of cool. But between that beginning chunk and the very end of the book, there's a lot of stuff in the middle that I didn't really like. I just didn't care about a lot of the plot developments that happened. Like, I don't know what I wanted this book to do, but it didn't really do it. And I also had a really hard time connecting to the characters. Like, Selena was fine, but I didn't really have strong feelings about her. And I really didn't care about her love interest. Initially, he was kind of an interesting character and I liked him enough, but the romance was so bizarre because it wasn't really insta-love, because they interact a few times before they start falling for each other, but it was like we completely skipped all the stuff in the middle where they start actually feeling the romantic feelings, because we go from them liking each other's company to the next scene they're together, Selena's thinking about how much she loves him and how he's the most important person in the world to her. And I'm like, when did you guys fall in love? It was just very odd. And I guess that's kind of my general feeling about this book, is it was odd and not in a way that I really enjoyed. It felt kind of disjointed, and I gave Moonlight and Ashes 3 stars. The next book I finished is one that I started because I was having a really bad night and I just really got in the mood to finally pick up and read this book, and I'm so glad I did. It was just the pick-me-up I needed, and that was The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. Our main character is a girl named Olive, and she's kind of grown up as the unlucky twin because she has a twin sister who always seems to get everything and win everything, and Olive is kind of like the afterthought. And at her sister's wedding, everybody in the entire wedding party gets food poisoning except for her and the groom's best man, who is his brother, and the honeymoon that her sister and her husband were going to go on is already paid for, and she won it in a giveaway, in a sweepstakes type thing, which means that they're very strict about the rules for who can use it, so they don't want to waste that amazing vacation. So her sister convinces Olive and Ethan, the best man, to go on the trip instead of them and basically pretend to be them. So we have fake dating, or fake engagement or marriage, I guess, and we also have hate to love, because Olive and Ethan both hate each other. Since they met, they've really not gotten along. I really loved the main characters. Olive as a protagonist, I just really enjoyed her, and I really understood her, and I got where she was coming from. She's stubborn, but not in a way that's frustrating. And then Ethan, I really ended up liking him too. And another thing that I loved about this book is that the reason that Olive and Ethan hate each other, that kind of misunderstanding, felt very believable to me, especially on Olive's side. Yes, in a way it was jumping to conclusions, but I really understand why she reacted that way. If I had been in that situation, I think I probably would have responded that way. I'm just so happy that I found an adult romance novel that I love, because I've been having trouble getting into them, and I'm also really happy that I found a contemporary hate-to-love romance that I love, because I talked recently in a video about how that's something I have a really hard time enjoying. I tend to like hate-to-love in fantasy or historical fiction. And another thing I loved about this book is the family relationships. Olive and her sister and their whole family, I just loved them. I loved all of the scenes that they were in. I loved the way that they were always there for each other, and the conflict of this book did not come from family members not treating each other well. They definitely misunderstand each other, they definitely fight. They're not a perfect family by any means, but I never got the feeling that the problems were caused by them not caring about each other. I also really loved the romance. It was really cute and romantic and also funny. I just loved all of Ethan and Olive's interactions, and of course I loved all of the scenes where they had to pretend to be married in front of people. In romance novels, there's that part near the end where it's generally a misunderstanding or a last minute breakup or kind of thing between the two leads, and in this book, when that happened, I actually understood it. And not just that I understood why it happened, but the reason that Olive and Ethan are we can't be together unless we resolve this and figure this out. I was yes, this is a huge issue that you guys need to talk about. It's something that I would actually have been really disappointed in Olive if this hadn't been an issue for her, so the fact that she did have a problem with it just made me love her even more. I gave the Unhoneymooners 4 stars, but honestly I can't remember why I took off points because I just really loved this. This was exactly what I wanted at the moment. I do remember thinking that there could have been a little more to explore about Olive and her family's background. I think the author's note mentions that they are Mexican. I think there just could have been a little more about that in the story, and especially with how that may have contributed to people thinking of Olive as too aggressive. So I would have maybe liked to see some of that, but like, as a cute fluffy romance, I just really loved this, and maybe I'll bump up my rating because this was just so cute. Next I finished Swift by R.J. Anderson, and this is actually a reread for me. We follow our main character Ivy, and she is a fairy. Specifically she's a type called a Pisky. She kind of lives in this underground haven. One of the really interesting things about this book is the setting is very like old world fairy feeling, but it is kind of set in contemporary times because there is like a nearby human town where they have like cars and modern conveniences and things like that. So the fairies, their world is very separate from the human world, or they try to keep it that way, but we do see like interactions between them and kind of how having a human settlement so close affects them, which I found really interesting. And several years ago Ivy's mother went missing, and everything that they were always told is that she was taken by Spriggans, which are this race of fairies that the Piskies have been raised to hate and fear, like they're their mortal enemy. Then Ivy starts finding some information that maybe suggests that people are keeping things from her about what happened to her mother. So Ivy decides to set out to try and find her mother, and then while all of this is happening, some Piskies are also starting to go missing. I really like Ivy as a main character. I love the setting and the world. Also, possibly my favorite part of this book was the friend or companion or like tentative ally that Ivy makes along the way. That is a fairy Ivy knows as Richard. We know from the beginning that's not his real name, but that's what Ivy knows him as. He is just such a fascinating character. His arc I think is really well done. I can't wait to get to the second book because I know that gets even better. And also, like, he's introduced quoting Shakespeare, so of course I'm going to love him. And another thing I think this book does so well is exploring different groups and the assumptions and prejudices they have against each other. Like Richard, Ivy and her people know as Spriggans, so Ivy is very reluctant to trust him and even to like take him along with her at one point. And so throughout the book we see her start to realize that the things that she has grown up knowing might not actually be true. I just really enjoyed this. I gave Swift 4 stars. Next I finished In Darkling Wood by Emma Carroll, and this is a sort of contemporary fantasy. There are fairies in it, but it's a very contemporary feeling book. We follow our main character Alice, and right at the beginning of the book she and her family find out that Theo, her little brother, has finally qualified for a heart transplant. He's been sick for a very long time, and so the book opens with them rushing to the hospital to get him that, and he gets the transplant, and then he doesn't get better as quickly as everyone thinks that he should. So Alice and her whole family are really afraid for him, and then to make things even worse for Alice, she's not even allowed to stay with her brother. For convenience and for his own health, she gets sent to stay with her grandmother, who she has never met and who is not really happy to have her staying with her. And then she finds this wood in kind of her grandmother's backyard, and she starts finding evidence of fairies that live in this wood, or she starts hearing stories about them, and of course Alice doesn't believe these. But more and more she starts to wonder if there could be some truth to it, and somehow she starts to wonder if her brother's health could somehow be connected to this wood and these fairies. Like if she can stop her grandmother from cutting down the wood like she wants to, if she can save the wood, then she can save her brother Theo. And then throughout the book we're also getting chapters that are from the time of the First World War. We're hearing letters from a girl to her brother at the front. I immediately connected to these characters. The writing is done in a way that feels very immediate. It's not especially descriptive or flowery, but the emotions are so clear in the way that Emma Carroll wrote. I mean, like right from the first couple pages, like I was so invested in this family and I was hoping that her brother would be okay. And I just think that feeling of immediacy carried through the whole book. I also loved the blend of a grounded contemporary story with very real problems with this sprinkle of whimsy or fantasy. I also really liked the way the plot was done, and this is one of those books that to me felt predictable in a really good way, because there were certain big things that I saw coming in this book, and I don't think Emma Carroll's necessarily trying to fool you with them. I almost appreciated them more knowing what was coming. I was just really impressed by this book. It was so much more emotional and bittersweet than I was expecting, but in a really beautiful way, and I gave In Darkling Wood 4 stars. Next I finished The Bells by Danielle Clayton. We follow our main character Camellia, and she lives in this kind of New Orleans inspired fantasy world, and she is one of these people called the Bells. And in this world, everybody except the Bells is born colorless or gray, and with red eyes, and they don't have any color of their own, basically. And the only people born with color are the Bells. And they are also the only ones who can give color to other people. That is their calling and that is their job. And at the beginning of the book, Camellia is competing with several other Bells to become the favorite, who is the Belle that lives at the palace and serves the royal family. And she ends up getting what she wants, sort of, but then realizing that there is a lot more going on at the palace than she thought. So Camellia is trying to navigate this world of court politics, and plots and danger, and then the queen asks Camellia to use her bell powers in ways that nobody is supposed to, and that would risk Camellia's life. And so she has to decide if she wants to do that. And this whole time, Camellia is starting to realize that there's a lot more to her powers and to the Bells than she thought, and that maybe this obsession with beauty is not actually a good thing. I really liked the writing and the setting. I can see why not everybody would be a fan, but I actually really enjoyed the way this really opulent world was described, and I could always picture the settings really well. I also really loved the magic and understanding how that worked, like how the Bells actually go about changing people. Some of it was very disturbing because it's supposed to be, but I just found the whole concept of the Bells fascinating and really explored in an interesting way. I think one of the criticisms people had for this book is that it didn't go far enough with the critique of beauty standards. And I actually didn't feel that way. I actually think this book did a really good job of showing how awful it was, in really more subtle ways. Camellia, she is just starting, like by about the middle of the book to the end, she is just starting to realize that she is a part of this really horrible thing. So it made sense to me why she wasn't like instantly on board to like try and start a revolution to fix all of this, because she's grown up thinking that she, like, this is like her divine gift, that she is like meant to bring beauty and happiness to people through changing their bodies and all of this. I thought her development and her realizing like what was really going on, what she was actually a part of, just like the seedy underbelly of this world that she lives in, I actually found that very compelling and very well done. My biggest complaint with this book was one of the side characters who was kind of like the love interest in this book. I hated him. Like, he just was so irritating. Like, all of his conversations with Camellia felt very like immature. Like, it was like this was an argument that you would have with like a 10-year-old maybe. And I don't think we were supposed to feel that. Like, I think we were supposed to be charmed by him. But other than that, I really enjoyed this, and I gave The Bells 4 stars. Next, I finished Revolution by Jennifer Donnelly. This is a dual timeline novel, and the modern day timeline, we follow a girl named Andy. And after a horrifying tragedy in her family, she kind of gets shipped off to stay with her dad in Paris. All she wants to do is get her final project done for her music class. She starts getting more interested in Paris when she comes across the diary of a girl who lived during the French Revolution. And it seems like this girl may even have a connection to what Andy is studying for her project. And Andy starts becoming very interested in trying to figure out what happened to this girl, who she was, and how she possibly can connect to Andy. This was such an intense reading experience. Like, obviously I knew the timeline set during the French Revolution would be that way, but I didn't really expect the modern day plotline to be so draining and so upsetting. Like, in the back of the book, it does say rage and grief are destroying her, so it talks about how devastated and upset Andy is, but I was not expecting it to be like multiple suicide attempts, drug abuse, like that kind of devastated. Like, the modern day timeline was really, really, really upsetting to read. And it was also really hard to read because Andy was so like willfully self-destructive, which I know is a real thing that happens to people, but I just wish there had been a clearer indication of that in the book's summary. There were like no real sparks of hope for the longest time. But I did really enjoy the Revolution plotline and the way that one was done. Like, Alexandrine, I think is her name. I'm sorry if you can hear Petey, he's really upset at having the door shut. But Alexandrine, the girl who lived during the French Revolution, her storyline I was so invested in, and it was kind of interesting because throughout the book I sort of went back and forth between which timeline I found more compelling, because there were times when I just wanted Andy to like work on fixing her own life and work on like getting better. And then there were also times where I was sort of like mirroring Andy's feelings of like just being obsessed with finding out what happened to Alexandrine in the past. Something I was really impressed with was the way that Jennifer Donnelly, she was very balanced when it came to talking about the French Revolution. I think she did a great job of showing how oppressed and mistreated the poor and common people were by the aristocrats, and how like something had to change, like democracy should have happened. I think she did a really great job of showing that, and then also showing like the way that some of the revolutionaries responded and the things that they did were still horrible and they shouldn't have done them. I also really loved the mystery and trying to figure out how these two timelines connected. There were some things that I did figure out with it, but it was kind of what I was talking about earlier in Darkling Wood, where even if I knew what was coming, I was so excited to see how it would be done. And then I also really love kind of the main message of this book, which is basically that doing small good things, like small kindnesses, it will not necessarily save the world by itself or change the world by itself or even save a person by itself. But if you continue doing those things, you will prevent yourself from becoming as cruel as the world is. Jennifer Donnelly says that much better in the book, but I just really appreciated that idea, and the way it was shown in this book was just so poignant and heartbreaking and beautiful. I think Andy as a main character was actually one of the weakest links of this book, and not just because like it was really draining reading from her perspective, but I think she was just a very difficult character to get to know, because her whole, like, part of her whole thing is like keeping everybody out, and that kind of extended to like keeping the reader out at some points. And I also had a real issue with the way that she treated basically everybody around her. Like there were some times where she was very justified in being angry at people, and then there were a lot more times where I didn't feel like she was. And I understand that people who are going through grief, sometimes they lash out and that's how they try to deal with it. But like having bad things happen to you doesn't mean you can treat people however you want. I also really didn't care about the romance plot in this book. I just think there was enough going on where we didn't need that. I would have loved for it to have stayed a friendship. And then one of my biggest problems with this book was the way that mental health was handled or not handled. So besides all of the stuff I've already mentioned, I mentioned at the beginning that Andy attempts suicide, or she has like suicidal ideation multiple times throughout the book. And I had a real issue with the way that was handled, and especially with the fact that like people in her life who cared about her knew that this was happening and they didn't try and get help for her. And I know this book is, I think it's about 10 years old maybe, so even in the last 10 years, our way of talking about mental health has come leaps and bounds, but it was really, really uncomfortable for me that all of these people in Andy's life who loved her didn't do anything about the fact that Andy almost killed herself several times throughout this book. Like, there was a point in this story where I'm like, I'm not even hoping for a happy ending anymore. I'm just hoping Andy doesn't commit suicide. Like, that's how dark this book got in some places. And another thing about mental health is that it somehow manages to excuse drug abuse and somehow also demonize medication. Andy consistently takes much higher than the safe dose for, I don't remember if it's antidepressants or antipsychotics or something, but she's like explicitly taking an overdose of this. And it's treated as like not a big deal, but at the same time, there's a point near the end of the book where Andy throws out her pills and it's treated as this like great moment and this sign that she's like starting to get better. And medication is a very complicated issue, and it's obviously a different treatment option for everybody, but I just felt like that was really irresponsible. And then like the whole treatment of like therapy in general, or just like getting help, was really not great. Like Andy just basically wants everybody to leave her and her mom alone so they can work through these things by themselves, which they are obviously incapable of doing. And I just don't feel like that was combated in a significant way. So I had a lot of mixed feelings with this book. I ended up giving Revolution 3.75 stars. Next, I finished A Kiss at Midnight by Eloisa James. This is a story loosely inspired by Cinderella. We follow our main character, Kate. She gets invited to the castle and has to pose as her sister. And while she is there, the prince starts paying a lot of attention to her, and they fall in love. And honestly, I can't remember what the main conflict of this book was, but it irritated me. Oh, I remember what it was. So the prince, Gabriel, he needs to marry somebody wealthy, and Kate, you know, being like the Cinderella character, she's obviously not wealthy, so like that's the thing that's between them, is like he has to marry this wealthy woman who he has no interest in, and him and Kate are in love. I hated this book. The only good thing I can really say about it is at the beginning I thought I was going to enjoy it. Because the first chapter or so I was actually really liking. I liked the writing. I thought Kate was set up as kind of a fun main character. I thought the dialogue was really enjoyable, and then just everything went downhill from there. There was a complete lack of consent for basically all of Kate and Gabriel's interactions. It made me so angry. Kate is adamant that she's not going to get involved with Gabriel at the beginning. She tells him, no, I don't want to kiss you, I don't want to be with you, and he consistently does it anyway. Like over and over again, Kate will say like, okay, we can do this, but I don't want to do this. And Gabriel's like, oh, okay. And then he does it anyway. And it just made me so angry and disgusted. Like at one point, she's like I think she's taking a bath in front of him. She says like, okay, you can touch my legs, but don't do anything more than that. So he starts like touching her legs and everything, and remember she's like naked in the bathtub, and he just like keeps going. So what ends up happening is he penetrates her with his fingers without her permission. There's not really a better way to say that, because that's what happens. He sexually assaults her. And this kind of thing kept happening throughout the book, and it's like, we're supposed to think it's okay because Kate is attracted to him, and afterwards she's like, oh, I did enjoy that, but no, I don't want to do it again. And then he like does it again, and it's like, it doesn't matter if she's attracted to him or if she ended up like being aroused when he did the thing that she said not to do. If she says don't do this and he does it, that is sexual assault, and I just hate it. Like this was the love interest who was doing this, so like how could I get behind this relationship? Also with the romance, there was the fact that cheating happened quite a bit in this book. Like this poor woman that Gabriel is engaged to sucks to be her, because he would be like at his engagement dinner with her, and then he'd be like, oh, excuse me for a minute. He'd like run off upstairs, have sex with another woman, and then like come back downstairs. And I just, like, that would have been one thing if Gabriel and this other woman had both like agreed that it wasn't going to be like an actual romantic relationship, but they hadn't. And the amount of girl hate in this book also enraged me. There is one other character besides Kate who is not an idiot or a slut or some combination of both. And I feel like the only reason we were allowed to have a woman who was also smart is because she was a lot older than Kate. So like she wasn't competing with her for the men's attention. Like, I don't know, it just had this weird feeling of like one girl in a generation can have a brain. Like in Kate's generation it's her, and in the older generation it's her godmother. And I actually liked her godmother's character initially, but she just became this like symbol for me of like how badly developed all of the other women in this book were throughout the book, and especially in the epilogue. There was like this really casual attitude towards like animal cruelty or animal death that really bothered me. Like not necessarily like people abusing animals, but Prince Gabriel has this like sort of menagerie of animals or something, and like there were several times where something would happen. Like at the end of the book you find out like the lion or elephant like choked to death on something, and it was told in a way like it was supposed to be like funny or like not a big deal, so I also didn't like that. Yeah, I hated pretty much everything about this book. I gave it 1 star. Next, I finished Sense of Sensibility by Jane Austen. This was our book for Austen Anonymous, and Taylor and I were joined by Yvette from Book Cave and Katie from A Sea of Tomes. So if you want to see what all of us thought about this book, I will link our live show down below. We follow Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood because of financial reasons and like entails and all of that. They end up losing quite a bit of their family income, so the two of them and their mother and their younger sister, but mainly the stories about Eleanor and Marianne, end up having to move to this little cottage in another county, and the book is about their relationship. They're very different ways of seeing the world. Like Eleanor is very practical, and Marianne is very romantic and dramatic, and it's also a lot about their romantic entanglements. I just really love the focus on sisterhood. I love that Eleanor is so sassy. I maintain that she is just as sassy as Elizabeth Bennet, but she's just better at disguising it, because she's unfailingly polite, but she has those retorts where it's like she says something to somebody and then you feel like 3 days later they'd suddenly realize like, wait, I think she called me stupid. And as with all of Jane Austen's books, the social commentary is just on point. I think this novel had some really interesting things to say about class, and especially about the romanticization of like genteel poverty of this time period. Like from our perspective, Eleanor and Marianne probably wouldn't look like they were that poor, but by the standards of the day, they definitely would have been considered like the genteel poor. And it was really interesting seeing how the wealthier characters found that like really charming, didn't really understand like the difference between their idea of what it would be like to live in a cottage and like what actually living in a cottage would be like. And then my only real negative for this book is related to the ending. I have a real problem with the way Marianne's story was resolved. I actually really like the direction she was heading in, where like she keeps her same personality, but she starts being a little more cognizant of the consequences that her actions or choices have. But like the very, very end of this book, I just think we didn't see enough scenes with these characters for me to believe what happened. So it ended up feeling kind of uncomfortable, but I gave Sense of Sensibility 4.5 stars. And finally, the last book I read in February was The Stars We Steal by Alexa Dunn. This is a persuasion retelling set in space, and also kind of blended with The Bachelor, I think. So we follow our main character Leonie, and her family are very like well respected, very high up, but they don't have any money anymore. And so as a result of this, Leonie is kind of forced to put herself forward for the Vogue, which is this like social season where all of the different ships in the fleet kind of send young people to kind of match up. And originally this was started as a way to diversify the gene pool so you wouldn't get like inbreeding or anything with this very limited group of people. She has to find a wealthy husband to marry in order to save her family from poverty, but she would much rather get her invention patent approved and make money that way. I really didn't like this book. I do really like the diversity and inclusion in this book and the way that this is set a few hundred years in the future. So I think it was nice that some of our world's prejudices did not continue into the future. Like, they have a special like mixer for queer people and things like that. Like, it seems like the ships do a lot better job at including queer people than our world sometimes does. But I found it believable that some of those prejudices would unfortunately still happen. Like, it almost seems like in the future the class system has become stricter even as other prejudices have kind of softened or faded away. And I also really loved Evgenia, I think was her name, one of the side characters. She was my favorite. I loved her. I wish she had been in the book more. I didn't really care about anybody else. That's not true. There was like one other character, but he doesn't show up until later in the book. Okay, so now into all of the things that I did not like about this book. First off, the writing. I really didn't like it, and I also had a lot of problems with like the actual like word choice that was used. Like, there were multiple times where a word would just be used incorrectly. Like, okay, if I don't like your word choice, fine, but you at least shouldn't be using words wrong, you know? So I really didn't like that, and just the writing in general felt very clunky to me. Some things were like really awkwardly like explained or over-explained. Like, Leonie would be in the ballroom and she's like, I'm gonna go stand over by my father. I hope he doesn't ask me if I found a man here I like. I really don't want to do this Vogue season, but I have to do it to save my family. And like, it was just very, it was like over-explaining the characters' emotions and motives rather than letting us get that from their interactions or their subtext. And then speaking of Leonie, I hated her. One thing she did that really pissed me off is that she constantly lied to people around her about her feelings and then got mad when they didn't like instinctively know what she actually wanted. She especially did this a lot with Elliot. I forgot to mention him. He's the man who she turned down a few years ago to marry, and he comes back and then there's like tension because it's a persuasion retelling. She would consistently lie to him about her feelings or about like what she wanted or what she thought. Like, he'd ask her if something bothered her and she would say, no, I'm fine. And inside she's like, how doesn't he know that this really bothers me? How could he assume that I'm fine? And it's like, because you just told him you were. She's afraid of getting hurt again, so she's not gonna like tell him that she still likes him. But the amount that this happened, I was like, you're past the bounds of believability for me. Like, this is just really irritating now. One of the reasons that persuasion works is because it's very believable why Anne and Captain Wentworth would not just talk about their feelings, like why they would misunderstand each other. For one thing, because they're in a time period where like you didn't do that. There were all these social restrictions about that. And for another thing, like, their interactions are done in a way where it feels believable why they could be interpreted one way or a completely different way. And in this book that didn't happen. I didn't believe why they wouldn't just like come out and tell each other how they felt. But probably the thing I hated most about Leonie is the way she treated other girls. And I took pictures, so I have the exact lines. Like, at one point, this is a direct quote, and she's talking about Evgenia, who like was saving her at a party from this guy that she really didn't want to dance with. She was rapidly becoming my favorite person, not only for this, but because she was currently the only woman I knew who wasn't trying to court Elliot. So Evgenia is a lesbian, and we consistently get lines like this where it's like, Leonie's favorite thing about Evgenia is that she's gay and not into Elliot. Like, anyone who spends time with Elliot, Leonie doesn't like, up to and including her own sister, who like specifically asks her over and over again, hey Leonie, are you okay with this? I know you and Elliot were involved, do you mind? And Leonie's like, no, it's fine. And then like, as soon as her sister starts like spending time with him, she gets pissed off about it. So there's one quote, and then a few pages later this happens because they're gonna have like a sleepover. She says, maybe this was just what I needed, someone to talk to be honest with, who didn't blame me and wasn't trying to win Elliot for herself. Like, that's it. That's her favorite thing about Evgenia, is that she's gay and not into Elliot. And I have one more because I just really hate the way that Leonie hated girls. Maybe I owed it to myself to try to parse out how much of my friend Evgenia had been real. Good friends, especially girlfriends, were a rare and valuable find. So apparently Leonie is under the impression that there's not that many girls out there who are nice people or who are worthy of being friends with. And it's like, you know what, Leonie, maybe you're the problem, because you're a bitch. Maybe that's why you don't have many friends who are girls, because you treat them like this. Except if you're a lesbian, because then you're not competition. And then they mentioned Elliot. I really didn't like him either. He was just kind of a jerk. and he had like no personality. I didn't understand the connection between him and Leonie. Like all of their scenes together were just so bland and uninteresting. They didn't have any like meaningful conversations together. Also, like the letter, the version this book did of the famous letter, like in Persuasion, was not good in my opinion. And then another thing that really bothered me is I feel like the author tried to do some representation and I feel like she did a bad job. Maybe she did have beta readers, I don't know, but there's a character who is asexual and I really don't feel like Alexa Dunn understood what that meant. At some points it kind of feels like she confused asexual with aromantic, and then at other points it just kind of felt like she didn't think things through. Like if this character was ace, like how they would feel about certain other things. Like I just feel like it was really badly done. Like points for her for trying to include an asexual character, but just didn't feel especially accurate or thoughtful. So as you can probably tell, I really didn't like this book. I feel like it's gotten pretty good reviews, so feel free to seek out other opinions. I just had a lot of things that bothered me about it. I gave The Stars We Steal 2 stars. Okay everybody, so that was finally all of the books I read in February. Please let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, and let me know a book you read recently that you really loved or that made you feel happy. Let's spread some good vibes and positive feeling here. I hope you all are doing well and staying safe. I'm thinking of you all and sending you lots of love. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!